So Mr. Lee, here's our advice to you whether Singapore should introduce protectionist measures. Now before that, let's take a look at Singapore's current stance on free trade. In today's globalized world, countries engage in international trade and Singapore is no exception. International trade is the exchange of goods and services across national borders. Singapore is a highly trade-dependent economy with the highest trade to GDP ratio in the world, averaging around 400% during 2008 and 11. The percentage is an indicator of the relative importance of international trade in the economy of a country. It is calculated by dividing the aggregate value of imports and exports over a period by the gross domestic product (GDP) for the same period. So the high value of trade to GDP ratio indicates that Singapore imports and exports far more than what it produces, so it acts as a trade hub. Her small domestic market of 5 million consumers also means that the industries rely on overseas export markets to absorb their outputs. Singapore is in fact the 20th largest export economy in the world. Besides exporting local products, she also relies heavily on imports for her food, energy, and industrial raw materials. Singapore has historically been a free trading nation, implementing practically no barriers to the free flow of goods in and out of country. Mr. Lee, before you come to a conclusion on whether to introduce protectionist measures, you may want to take a look at the constraints Singapore faces. Firstly, Singapore has trade relations with its current major trading partners. Singapore already has 21 free trade agreements, also known as FTAs, and economic partnership agreements, EPAs, in force. The latest FTA signed by Singapore is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, also known as TPP. It is a free trade agreement, FTA, between 12 countries such as Australia, Brunei, Canada, Japan, and the United States. Collectively, these countries represent 40% of global GDP, one-third of the world trade, and comprise a population of 800 million, making the TPP the largest regional trade agreement to date. An FTA is an agreement whereby member countries agree to remove tariff and non-tariff barriers among themselves, but each can retain whatever restrictions she wants for non-member countries. Usually, it also includes better terms for investments in foreign countries. These treaties make trade and investments among the member countries easier. Hence, these economic partnership agreements signed by Singapore since it opened its economy in 1993, with the signing of its first FTA under the ASEAN Free Trade Area, AFTA, will mean that she has to adhere to the regulations of the removal of trade barriers to its member countries and won't be able to introduce protectionist measures to these countries in the short term. Secondly, Singapore's comparative advantage due to its climate and resource endowment. A country is said to have comparative advantage in the production of a good when she can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another country. Comparative advantage differs among countries due to the fact that factor or resource endowment differs across countries. These comparative advantages are limited by the resource in Singapore, such as presence of skilled labor, advanced technology, good infrastructure such as industrial parks, and research and development (R&D) facilities like biopolis, and a lack of natural resources. Hence, whether Singapore has the ability to introduce protectionist measures like impose tariff on foreign imports will stem from the comparative advantage Singapore possesses. As Singapore has a shortage of land and lacks favorable climate for agricultural activities, it may be unrealistic for Singapore to introduce protectionist measures and limit imports of agriculture and fresh products such as vegetables. In addition, Singapore lacks mineral deposits. It will not be feasible to introduce protectionism on primary commodities such as oil, metals like copper, which are all crucial for our industries here. Lastly, Singapore's independence on trade for economic growth. In any given year, an economy's trade balance is in surplus when the value of the goods and services that it exports exceeds that of its imports. In 2001, Singapore's trade surplus was 26.7% of our GDP, also known as national income, which is far higher than most of major countries like China, 2.8%, Germany, 5.1%, and Hong Kong, 4.0%. Hence, Singapore is a highly trade-dependent economy with the highest trade to GDP ratio in the world, limiting its ability to introduce protectionist measures which may negatively affect its export revenue if its trade partners were to retaliate. Trade is an engine for growth in Singapore. Singapore utilizes its international trade to grow its economy. Trade grants Singapore access to overseas market, hence Singapore will have a larger foreign market for their domestic products, as the local market of 5 million consumers is relatively small, with little demand. For FTAs with nations that are fast growing, the demand for Singapore's goods will likely increase due to the concept of YED. Firstly, Mr. Lee will need to identify accurately infant industries that have potential comparative advantage. An infant industry is one that potential comparative advantage but is too young or undeveloped to realize this potential, especially in the face of more established foreign competitors with the trend towards globalization. One example of an infant industry in Singapore, which will be elaborated later on in the video, is 3D printing. Secondly, we need to know the extent of effect of protectionist measures that Singapore introduces on the trade position of our major trading partners, as their exports to Singapore will start to fall. Trading partners may retaliate with its own set of protectionist measures, and Singapore's export revenue will fall as well. We need to have the different balance of trade BOT values with different trading partners for this information. Lastly, Mr. Lee will need to know whether there are good and close domestic substitutes with CED cross-elastic demand more than one for local consumers that are used to using imported goods. If there are no close or good domestic substitute, the ultimate cost of protectionism will have to be borne by our domestic consumers, who now have to pay higher prices for imported goods and suffer welfare loss.
These are reasons for protectionism. Protectionism provides protection for sunrise industries, which are also known as infant industries. An infant industry is one that has the potential to develop a comparative advantage, but is too underdeveloped at a point in time, especially in the face of established foreign competitors. Subsidies help lower the cost of production and the price of products, making them more competitive against foreign producers. Protectionism is necessary in the short run to help an industry establish its market share globally. However, I understand that there are a few limitations. Firstly, the domestic industry may become complacent and inefficient if protectionism is implemented as a long-term measure. Next, the government may end up protecting industries that fail to develop a comparative advantage. Lastly, there is no definitive method of identifying genuine and potential infant industries. Lim Swee Say, a cabinet minister in Singapore's Prime Minister office, once spoke on the urgent need to futurize Singapore. He urged for companies to look towards sunrise industries such as 3D printing. It has begun to replace some of mass-manufactured products such as hearing aids, implants, and prosthetics. You can 3D print jewelry in gold, brass, and steel. This is a possible sunrise industry with potential comparative advantage for Singapore. It is interesting to note, while Singapore may not have a comparative advantage in 3D printing currently, Singapore has many strengths to take advantage of this sunrise industry. We have an existing talent pool of 3D modelers, graphic designers, and software engineers, and good industrial parks to support the development of this technology. So this sunrise sector can potentially offer many good job opportunities for Singaporeans and generate great export revenues. Hence, it may be wise to introduce short-term protectionist measures such as domestic subsidies to help lower the cost of production and help lower the price of products due to the law of demand. This helps them become more competitive against the more efficient foreign producers. Protection can be given until infant industries mature and is able to compete with large foreign firms. Protectionism is therefore necessary in the short run to produce a level playing field for domestic infant industries. Protectionism provides protection for the sunset industries. Protectionism protects industries that are no longer competitive to prevent massive structural unemployment that can arise due to the higher rates of economic transformations and technological transfers. The presence of foreign competitors also pose a challenge to remain competitive with greater flow of cheaper imports. However, I understand that there are certain limitations. Firstly, the protection of sunset industries slow down restructuring processes and prolongs inefficient allocation of resource. Next, the removal of protection may be met with resistance in the future. With the trend to globalization, there can be a drop in the demand for locally produced goods due to greater flow in cheaper imports from countries. It may be due to a greater cheap labor in populous countries like India and China. Fast-paced advances in technology for production causes Singapore to lose its comparative advantage to other countries, such as the local manufacturing sector currently. The workers previously employed in the main economic sector will be unemployed as the sector continues to contract. The government may want to introduce tariffs to increase the price of imports so that consumers will switch to domestic substitutes, increasing domestic production. This provides sunset industries with a buffer period for their workers to pick up new relevant skills through the Skills Future scheme, which provides upgrading and trading of skills and for workers to seek unemployment in other expanding sectors, such as the sunrise industries in the economy. Sunset industries can also utilize this period to undergo massive restructuring to compete with foreign competitors again. The Ministry of Manpower, MOM's recent report indicated that Singapore's employment rate fell by 6,100 workers in the first quarter of 2015. This marked the first time employment has dipped after 5 years of strong increases. Meanwhile, a separate MOM report stated that the number of job vacancies had climbed 8.9% to 67,400 in September last year, the highest in 6 years. This indicates that there may be a possible skills gap for unemployed workers who are previously employed in the contracting sector of the economy and are unable to get employed in the growing economic sectors due to the lack of expertise and relevant skill sets. According to the MOM report, the loss of jobs was led by contracting manufacturing sector, which was mainly due to weak output in marine and offshore engineering, followed by the services sector, namely retail trade, accommodation, and food services. Prime Staff's third quarter employment outlook report also states that there will be a greater demand for workers in the following sectors: IT, health and allied healthcare, and some areas of manufacturing, such as operations and technicians, this quarter. These sectors require a high level of skills and expertise, and hence protectionism is necessary in the short run to allow workers to have adequate time to adjust and learn new skills. This can better facilitate the restructuring of the local economy through restraining of workers or to regain its comparative advantage through restructuring.
Protectionism also protects Singapore market against dumping. Dumping refers to the selling of goods to a foreign country at a lower price than the one charged to domestic buyers and below the marginal cost of production. The objective is to drive out rival producers in the importing country and eventually monopolize the local market. Production is often subsidized by the government. This leads to unfair competition with producers in the importing countries. In the 1990s, Singapore had the Countervailing and Anti-Dumping Act, an act against dumping of goods imported into Singapore and the imposition of duties to nullify dumping. It was abolished before the 2000s. Therefore, should Singapore introduce protectionist measures to curb anti-dumping? We believe more statistics and information is needed before Singapore introduces protectionist measures in the name of anti-dumping. Domestic producers of particular products may argue that they are unfairly victimized by competing foreign imports that are dumped in domestic markets. For example, prices of local greens are estimated to be 15% higher than those of imported vegetables, owing to relatively higher labor costs and rents. However, sometimes domestic producers' accusation of dumping and unfair trading practice at foreign producers may not necessarily be true. It may be due to the fact that they cannot match the lower prices of their foreign rivals. Foreign firms could be more efficient and thus be able to undercut domestic producers by selling similar products at lower or more competitive prices. In practice, this is often very difficult to prove dumping, as there is a fine line between discriminatory pricing and differential pricing. Hence, We advise Mr. Lee to collect more information and ensure whether allegations of dumping is true before introducing such drastic measures.
If dumping were to occur in Singapore in future, is protectionist measure the way to solve this, and what limitations does it have? With explanation with reference to the figure, DD and SD represent the domestic demand and supply. Without tariff, at a world price of PW, consumers will buy Q2 of goods, and local producers produce only at Q1. As a result, Q1, Q2 will be imported. To protect the home industry against dumping, the government levies a specific tariff on the imported good, thus raising the supply curve from SW to SW plus tariff. The price now increases from PW to P2. At P2, domestic production increases from 0Q1 to 0Q3. Domestic buyers are buying fewer imports from 0Q2 to 0Q4. The tariff has caused a fall in the amount of imports from Q1, Q2 to Q3, Q4. Since the price is higher after the tariff, consumers are worse off compared to having free trade as consumer surplus is reduced. The loss in consumer surplus is equal to areas A plus B plus C plus D. Though producers gain in producer in terms of increased domestic production and higher price of the good, area A, and government can expect to collect an amount of tax revenue equivalent to area C, the loss of consumer surplus of areas B and D are not transferred to other sectors of the economy. They are deadweight loss to the society.
Some countries may introduce protectionist measures against harmful products like alcohol and cigarettes. For social and/or environmental reasons, Singapore levies high excise taxes on beer, wine and liquor, tobacco products, motor vehicles and petroleum products. Introduction of protectionist measures may adversely impact Singapore's major trading partners, who may retaliate with its own set of protectionist measures as well. This may affect Singapore's export revenue negatively. As defined by Investopedia, the world's leading source of financial content from the web, a country whose total value of all imported goods is higher than its value of all exports is said to have a negative trade balance or a deficit. In 2015, Singapore incurred the highest trade deficits with the following countries such as Taiwan, United States and Saudi Arabia. Hence, if Singapore were to introduce protectionist measures, these countries would adversely be affected as they suffered a great loss in export revenue. These countries may retaliate with its own set of protectionist measures, affecting Singapore's export revenue as well. Okay.
The government needs to consider multiple perspectives when deciding whether to introduce protectionist measures from the standpoint of domestic producers or workers, consumers, and foreign countries. If protectionism is introduced, imports will be reduced and there will be an increase in domestic production. Infant industries that have potential comparative advantage but is too young to realize its potential, especially in the face of more established foreign competitors in the globalized world, will benefit from protectionism. They will have more time to mature and expand their output to become more competitive against foreign producers so that they can have the same level of playing field. Hence, protectionism can be imposed in the short run. The government may also introduce protectionist measures to allow new industries to grow. On the other hand, protectionism threatens the consumer's rights to choose from among goods and services. Consumers have to pay more due to tariffs and quotas. Protectionist measures by Singapore may lead to retaliation of foreign countries, and they might also create tariffs or trade barriers on their imports. This may result in a trade war. The intended consequences are the benefits and costs anticipated by economists in terms of protecting sunrise industries from foreign competitors and allowing sunset industries to gradually fade out, slowing down the restructuring process and rendering adjustment assistance like retraining and skills upgrading to structurally unemployed workers. Singapore is a small, open and highly trade and resource dependent economy with no natural resources. Hence, protectionism, which is the restriction of the free flow of trade, capital, and labor in the globalized world, is detrimental to Singapore. The unintended consequence is that local industry may become too complacent and inefficient as it lacks the incentive to become more efficient and innovative or produce high quality products. It may not be able to compete with foreign competitors in the long run under the long-term protection. The government may have imperfect information. It will become increasingly difficult to cherry-pick potential successful industries. The government will need to identify a growth sector and work towards making it a key part of the economy by protecting it from foreign competitors, but risks are involved. The infant industries pick may not turn out to be as successful as intended, hence protectionism may result in inefficient use of precious resources. Furthermore, protectionism by restrictive quotas generate new competition in foreign countries due to quotas on Singapore's export as foreign countries start producing certain goods that they have never produced before because of the quotas granted to them. The imposition of protective tariffs to allow sunset industries to fade out may slow down the restructuring process and prolong the inefficient use of economy's resources. Sunset industries end up attracting new capital that might have been better spent elsewhere. There is no rationale for protecting such a company anymore, because if it becomes innovative, it should not need protection. Since protectionism tends to shield the inefficient industries to prevent sudden massive structural unemployment, it then causes the death of those that can compete as they are left to the vagaries of the market while weaker ones are protected.
Singapore may change its stance if local and global conditions are expected to change in the future, like for instance, global recession and loss of comparative advantage of local industries over time. Recessions are a time of economic uncertainty and retrenchment. In times of global financial recession, protectionism cushions domestic industries, which are at least assured of stability of access to the internal market in the short term. Protectionism thus offers domestic firms a shield against fluctuating prices and international competition. It may be wise for Singapore to introduce protectionist measures if she loses its comparative advantages in many aspects, so that Singapore's sunset industries can fade out gradually and have time to undergo massive restructuring. This will allow the sunset industries to regain its comparative advantage.
Though we do not advocate Mr. Lee to introduce protectionist measures for Singapore in the long run, we do hope Mr. Lee will understand that Singapore's heavy dependence on trade for growth makes it vulnerable to global economic recessions or slow growth. Quoting CIMB economist Song Seng-Woon, uneven economic growth around the world has led to seesawing export growth from around the region. Singapore is not alone in seeing less than inspiring export growth in 2014. Singapore's electronic exports in particular continued to struggle, partly due to the still soft demand for products such as disk drives and semiconductors. Thus, the Singapore economy is susceptible to demand shocks. However, it will be more beneficial if Singapore engages in free trade in the long run.